By the fire's glow, the truth is always revealed. Welcome to the Fireside Casebook.
The rain in Sutherland did not so much fall as it did colonise. It was a fine, pervasive Scotch mist that ignored the concept of waterproof fabric, seeping into the marrow of one's bones and turning the majestic peaks of Sullivan and Canisp into sulking grey ghosts. Police Constable Hamish Macbeth sat on a damp rock by the banks of the river and Dun, his tall, lanky frame hunched inside a regulation greatcoat that had seen better decades. Beside him, Lugs, a dog of indeterminate breed and cynical disposition, let out a long, wet sigh. "I know, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his voice a soft Highland lilt. "It's a grand day for a duck, but a poor one for a policeman with a hole in his boot." Hamish wasn't technically on duty, or rather, he was always on duty, which provided a convenient excuse to be nowhere in particular when the telephone rang at the police station. At that moment, his thin, freckled hands were busy with a length of nylon line and a very illegal, very beautiful silver salmon he had just pulled from the waters belonging to the local estate. To Hamish, poaching wasn't a crime. It was a traditional Highland method of grocery shopping. The law, he felt, should be applied like a good mustard, sparingly, and only when the meat was particularly foul. His peaceful contemplation of dinner was rudely interrupted by the aggressive roar of a Land Rover Defender, the shiny, overpriced kind that had never seen a day's work in a peat bog. It screeched to a halt near the bridge, splashing mud over Hamish's boots. Out stepped the personification of everything Lochdubh found distasteful. Julian Vane Tempest. Julian was a lifestyle consultant from London who had recently purchased the Gables, a Victorian monstrosity on the edge of the loch. He wore a tweed jacket that cost more than Hamish's annual salary, paired with pristine white designer Wellington boots. "You there, policeman!" Julian shouted, waving a manicured hand. "I've been ringing the station for an hour. Do you people actually work, or is the entire village drawing a pension for sitting in the damp?" Hamish slowly stood up, expertly sliding the poached salmon into a deep hidden pocket of his coat. Lugs gave a low, judgmental growl. "It's a soft day, Mr. Vane Tempest," Hamish said, his expression one of vacant bovine helpfulness. "The wires get a bit temperamental when the mist rolls in. Was there a crisis? Did a sheep look at you sideways?" Julian marched over, his face flushing a shade of red that matched the Highland heather. "Someone has moved the stones. The ancient boundary markers at the edge of my property. I want them arrested. It's trespassing, it's vandalism, and frankly, it's a symptom of the prehistoric attitude of this backwater." Hamish tilted his head, his hazel eyes deceptively blank. He knew exactly who had moved the stones. Old Angus had been moving those stones back and forth for 40 years in a slow-motion war with whoever owned the Gables. It was a local pastime, like shinty, but with more spite. "The stones, is it?" Hamish sighed. "They do wander, the stones. Especially after a heavy rain, the soil gets lubricated." "Don't give me that mystical Highlands rubbish," Julian snapped. "I'm hosting a mindful moorland retreat this weekend. Important people are coming. High-net-worth individuals. I won't have them seeing local hooliganism. Do your job, Macbeth, or I'll be speaking to your superiors in Strathbane. I hear DCI Blair is looking for reasons to close down these one-man stations." The threat hung in the air, colder than the rain. Closing the station meant a transfer. A transfer meant Glasgow or Aberdeen, grey pavements, sirens, and people who didn't know how to keep a secret. "I'll look into it, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a tone of exaggerated subservience. "I'll give the stones a stern talking to." Julian huffed, muttered something about inbred peasants, and climbed back into his shiny toy, spraying more mud as he sped off toward the village. Hamish watched the taillights vanish. The piece of Lochdubh was like a thin sheet of ice. Men like Vane Tempest didn't just walk on it, they stomped until everything cracked. "He's a man with a target on his back, Lugs," Hamish remarked, pulling the salmon out to admire its scales. And in this village, there are plenty of people with a very steady aim. He began the walk back to the village, the weight of the fish in his pocket, a comforting counterpoint to the growing unease in his gut. He needed a coffee at the Lochdubh Hotel and a bit of gossip from Mrs. Kennedy at the post office, because in the Highlands the only thing that travelled faster than the wind was the news of who deserved to die. The warmth of the Lochdubh Hotel's kitchen was a physical embrace, smelling of floor wax, roasted mutton, and the sharp acidic tang of Mrs. Curry's industrial-strength coffee. Hamish slipped through the back door, Lugs trotting at his heels with the practised stealth of a dog who knew where the butcher's scraps were kept. Mrs. Curry, a woman whose face was etched with the permanent disapproval of 40 years in the hospitality trade, didn't even look up from the thick slices of bread she was buttering. "I see you've been patrolling the river again, Hamish," she remarked, her eyes flicking briefly to the suspiciously heavy sag in his greatcoat. "The fish are jumping, then? It's a scientific observation, Mrs. Curry," Hamish replied, his expression one of wounded innocence as he sank into a chair. "Policemen must know the local wildlife. I'll have a coffee if the pot is on. Black as a funeral and twice as bitter, if you please." He had just wrapped his cold fingers around the chipped ceramic mug when the peace of the afternoon was not just broken but shattered. The front door of the hotel swung open with such violence that the bell didn't just ring, it shrieked. A woman stumbled into the hallway, her face a mask of frantic urban terror. She was dressed in an expensive yoga outfit of neon spandex that looked absurdly out of place against the dark oak panelling of the Highlands. "Help! Someone! He's in the yurt!" she screamed, her voice hitting a register that made Lugs howl in sympathy. Hamish let out a long, weary sigh, staring longingly at his coffee. "The yurt, you say? That would be Mr. Vane Tempest's spiritual sanctuary up at the Gables. He's dead," she wailed, collapsing into a chair near the fire. "Julian, he's stuck. Oh God, the smell." Hamish stood up slowly, the poached salmon in his pocket shifting with a wet thud against his thigh. He felt a familiar prickle of annoyance. A murder was a tragedy, certainly, but in Lochdubh it was also a massive administrative inconvenience. He looked at the rain lashing against the window and thought of the warm fire he was about to leave behind. "Stay there, Mrs. Curry. Give the lady some tea. Heavily sugared," Hamish instructed, his voice losing its dreamy quality and snapping into a tone of quiet authority. "Lugs, come." The walk up the hill to the Gables was a slog through deepening mud. The mindful moorland retreat appeared to be off to a disastrous start. 3 other guests, all looking like they had been plucked from a high-end London gallery, were huddled under a dripping larch tree, staring at a large circular tent of white canvas that sat in the middle of the garden. Hamish approached the yurt, noticing immediately that the ancient boundary stone Julian had complained about earlier was no longer in the field. It was now inside the yurt, or rather, it was half inside. Stepping through the flap, Hamish paused. The interior was decorated with expensive crystals, silk cushions, and enough incense to choke a Highland cow. In the centre of the room lay Julian Vane Tempest. He was face down on a velvet meditation mat, dressed in an intricate silk robe, but it was the boundary stone that drew the eye. The massive, moss-covered rock had been dropped, or pushed, directly onto the centre of Julian's back, pinning him to the earth in a way that was both gruesome and oddly ceremonial. A silver bowl of artisan organic porridge sat inches from his lifeless hand, now splattered with mud and grit. The lifestyle consultant had been crushed while seeking enlightenment, his pristine white Wellingtons sticking out from under the stone at an angle that suggested a very undignified end. "Aye, he's dead," Hamish muttered to the empty air, kneeling down beside the body. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. He could see the way the canvas of the yurt had been slit at the back, a clean vertical cut that allowed someone to tip the heavy stone from the outside. Luggs sniffed the air, then let out a low, disapproving grumble. Hamish nodded. There was a faint scent lingering beneath the heavy patchouli in expensive porridge. It was the smell of damp wool and something sharp, turpentine perhaps, or sheep dip. "It's a messy business, Luggs," Hamish whispered, his hazel eyes scanning the room. He noticed a small leather-bound notebook tucked into the folds of Julian's robe, its edges stained with the spilled porridge. He also noticed that Julian's expensive gold watch was missing, though his diamond ring remained on his finger. A robbery? No. A robbery wouldn't involve lugging a 100-pound boundary stone across a muddy field just to make a point. He looked at the body, then at the rain-streaked canvas. Julian had managed to offend the entire village in record time, but moving a stone like that required more than just anger. It required a Highlander's back and a very specific kind of patience. Hamish stood up, his joints creaking. He knew what came next. He would have to call the station in Strathbane. He would have to deal with the technicalities, the paperwork, and worst of all, he would have to deal with the arrival of the heavy-handed, loud-mouthed circus that was the Criminal Investigation Department. "I suppose I'd better phone it in," Hamish said, looking down at his muddy boots, "before Blair hears it on the grapevine and decides I've been hiding the body to save myself the paperwork." As he turned to leave, his hand brushed the salmon in his pocket. He would have to hide the fish before the detectives arrived. DCI Blair would like nothing more than to arrest a policeman for poaching while standing over a murder victim. It was going to be a very long, very hungry night. The walk back to the village police station felt like a funeral march, though the only mourner was Luggs, who seemed particularly aggrieved by the lack of immediate dinner. Hamish moved with a deceptive lethargy, stopping briefly at his own small cottage to deposit the poached salmon into the vegetable crisper of his fridge, safely hidden beneath a wilted head of cabbage. By the time he reached the station and picked up the telephone, the mist had thickened into a heavy shroud, muffling the sounds of the loch but doing nothing to dampen the roar of the convoy that arrived 40 minutes later. The silence of Lochdubh was obliterated by the wail of sirens that seemed entirely unnecessary given the absence of traffic, followed by the aggressive crunch of gravel as 2 police sedans and a forensic van skidded to a halt outside the hotel. Out of the lead car exploded Detective Chief Inspector Blair, a man whose blood pressure appeared to be in a permanent race with his ambition. His face was a shade of puce that nearly matched the siren lights, and his belly strained against the buttons of a cheap suit that was never intended for the Highland climate. "Macbeth!" Blair bellowed, his voice echoing off the stone walls and lightly waking the dead in the local kirkyard. "You useless, long-legged streak of misery. I leave you alone for 5 minutes to watch a village of 300 people, and you manage to let a high-profile Londoner get flattened like a pancake." Hamish stood by the station door, his hands deep in his pockets, his expression one of vacant, wide-eyed wonder. "It's a terrible business, sir. The stones in these parts have a mind of their own when the ground gets soft. A tragedy, truly." "Don't give me your myths and legends garbage," Blair snapped, shoving past Hamish and nearly tripping over Luggs. "Get that mangy rug out of my way. And you, stay put. I don't want your muddy prints all over my crime scene. You've probably already contaminated the evidence with your sheep dip smell." Hamish watched with a sigh as Blair and his team, including the sycophantic Detective Sergeant Anderson, marched up the hill toward the gables. Despite Blair's orders, Hamish followed at a discreet distance, lingering near the edge of the yurt as the CID team began their chaotic efficiency. Inside the tent, Blair didn't so much investigate as he did stomp. He stood over Julian Vane Tempest's body, his nose wrinkled in disgust. "Look at this," Blair announced, gesturing broadly at the incense burners and silk cushions. Lifestyle consultant? Looks more like a cult leader. Probably got into a row with one of these granola-munching Londoners over who gets the last organic lentil. Sir, Anderson piped up, pointing toward the slashed canvas at the rear of the yurt. The slit in the fabric. Someone stood outside and tipped the stone. I can see that, Anderson. I have eyes, Blair barked. He turned his gaze toward the small crowd of retreat guests who were shivering under the trees. His eyes locked onto a man in a thick wool sweater who looked particularly miserable, old Angus, the village's most notorious curmudgeon, who'd been found lingering near the garden fence with a shovel in his hand. You, Blair shouted, pointing a stubby finger at Angus. You're the one who's been having the boundary dispute with the deceased, aren't you? Macbeth mentioned some local hooliganism over stones. Old Angus spat a glob of tobacco juice into the mud. The man was a Sassenach fool who didn't know his north from his elbow. He put his meditation tent on my grazing land. I was just checking my fence. Checking your fence with a shovel? Or using that shovel to lever a 200-pound rock onto a man's spine? Blair's eyes gleamed with the prospect of a quick arrest and a warm bed back in Strathbane. It's obvious. A local grudge, a heavy stone, and a motive as old as the hills. Anderson, take this man's statement, and don't be gentle. I want a confession by sundown. Hamish, leaning against a dripping larch tree outside the flap, winced. He knew Angus was a spiteful old man who would happily move a stone 6 inches a night for a decade just to annoy a neighbour, but Angus lacked the theatricality required for such a murder. The placement of the body, the ceremonial porridge, the missing watch, none of it fit the profile of a simple Highland land dispute. Begging your pardon, sir, Hamish interjected, his voice soft and hesitant, but Angus has a bad hip. He can barely lift a kettle, let alone tip a boundary stone with that kind of precision. And there's the matter of the victim's watch. It's gone, but his ring is still there. If it was a robbery, why leave the diamond? Blair whirled around, his face turning an even deeper shade of violet. I told you to shut it, Macbeth. You're a village bobby, not Sherlock Holmes. The watch probably fell into the mud. Or maybe the old man took it as a trophy. Either way, I've got my man. Now get back to your station and start making the tea. My men are freezing, and I expect a hot meal waiting for us at the hotel. Move. Hamish nodded obediently, cast a sympathetic look at the bewildered Angus, and began to retreat. He knew better than to argue with a man who had already made up his mind. But as he walked away, he looked back at the mindful moorland guests. One of them, a pale woman with sharp, bird-like features, was watching Blair with an expression that wasn't fear, but something much closer to relief. Hamish's mind whirred beneath his sleepy exterior. Blair might have his suspect, but Hamish knew that in Lochdubh, the loudest person in the room was usually the one who knew the least. It was time to go mooching for the truth. The rain had graduated from a fine mist to a steady, rhythmic drumming on the slate roofs of Lochdubh by the time Hamish reached the bottom of the hill. Behind him, the blue lights of the police cars pulsed through the fog like a rhythmic headache, but down in the village square, life was attempting to maintain its usual, slow-motion pace. Hamish didn't return to the station. Instead, he steered his lanky frame toward the post office, a small, cramped shop that smelled of old paper, peppermint humbugs, and the distinct ozone scent of a village that knew everyone's business before it even happened. The bell above the door gave a cheerful ping that felt entirely too optimistic for a day featuring a crushed lifestyle consultant. Behind the counter sat Mrs. Kennedy, her spectacles perched on the very tip of a sharp nose that had sniffed out more scandals than the Highland constabulary ever would. So, the Londoner's gone to meet his maker under a bit of Sutherland granite, has he? She said, not even looking up from a ledger. I suppose it's one way to get a solid foundation for your life. Hamish leaned against the counter, his hat dripping onto the linoleum. "News travels faster than the water in the Andun, Mrs. Kennedy. I've barely had time to shake the mud off my boots." It was the sirens, Hamish. You'd think DCI Blair was announcing a royal visit the way he makes that noise. She huffed, finally looking up. Her eyes were bright with curiosity. "And Angus in the back of a van? That's a waste of a good van. The man can barely lift his arms to scratch his head, let alone heave a boundary marker." "Aye, well," the big men from Strathbane like a quick answer, Hamish murmured, his eyes wandering to the shelf of boiled sweets. "They don't much care if it's the right one. I don't suppose Mr. Vane Tempest was getting much mail that required a heavy lifter, or perhaps his mindful guests were sending out for more than just herbal tea." Mrs. Kennedy leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "He was getting a lot of registered mail, Hamish. Legal-looking envelopes from a firm in London, Bain and Bitterton. And that assistant of his, the pale creature with the eyes like a nervous bird? Serena, she calls herself. She's been in here 3 times this week, crying over the price of international stamps and looking like she wanted to bolt for the hills." "Serena," Hamish repeated, the name tasting like city smoke in his mouth. She looked a bit relieved when Blair was shouting at poor Angus. "Relieved? I'd say she was ecstatic," Mrs. Kennedy added, tapping a finger on the counter. "And there's the other one, a man named Godfrey. Claims he's an emotional architect. He was in here yesterday asking if the loch was deep enough to hide. Well, he said, to hide the stresses of the world. But he looked like he was weighing up the water for a body." Hamish let out a soft and accepted a peppermint humbug that Mrs. Kennedy slid across the wood. He moved on, his next stop being the Lochdubh curry house. It was a small establishment run by Mr. Patel, who had moved to the Highlands for the peace and quiet, and instead found himself providing the only spicy alternative to Mrs. Curry's bland mutton stews. Mr. Patel was currently packing a thermal bag with 3 orders of extra mild korma. "For the Gables, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, shaking his head. "The guests. They said they couldn't possibly eat the hotel food while Julian was, you know. But apparently they are still very hungry for curry. Hungry is good for the soul, Mr. Patel," Hamish said, looking at the order slips. "Did Julian order too?" Before he became a permanent fixture of the landscape. "He ordered a volcano vindaloo last night," Patel said, leaning over the counter. "But he didn't eat it. I went to deliver, and I heard him arguing through the yurt canvas. He was shouting about the accounts and the offshore leak. He told someone they were a talentless leech who wouldn't get a penny of the buyout." Hamish's ears pricked up. A buyout. Accounts. Was it a man or a woman he was shouting at? A woman. She was sobbing. I didn't want to interrupt, so I left the bag at the door. When I went back this morning to collect the insulated bag, the food was untouched, cold as the loch. Hamish sighed, the pieces of the village puzzle beginning to clatter together in his mind. While Blair was busy trying to squeeze a confession out of a man with a bad hip, the real story was hidden in London legal letters, emotional architecture, and a very cold, very spicy curry. He needed more than just gossip, though. He needed to see how these Sassenachs interacted when they didn't think a stupid Highland policeman was watching. He stepped back out into the rain, his mind drifting toward the Lochdubh hotel bar. That was where the guests would be huddled now, seeking comfort in expensive whisky and whispered secrets. And as luck would have it, Priscilla Halberton Smythe, the daughter of the local estate owner, and Hamish's perennial romantic complication, was currently staying at the hotel. She had a way of seeing through the pretensions of the upper class that Hamish, for all his local wisdom, sometimes missed. He adjusted his soggy cap. He would have to time his entrance carefully. If Blair saw him, there would be more shouting. But if he slipped in through the residence lounge, he might just find out which of the mindful guests had a talent for heavy lifting and a motive for murder. The residence lounge of the Lochdubh Hotel was a sanctuary of faded chintz and heavy mahogany, usually occupied by elderly fishermen dozing over copies of The Field. Today, however, it hummed with the strained, high-pitched energy of urbanites in crisis. Hamish slipped in through the side door, the one that bypassed the main lobby, where Blair was currently making a loud, theatrical show of interviewing the hotel staff. Luggs, sensing the need for discretion, belly-crawled under a velvet-skirted sofa, leaving only the tip of his tail visible. Hamish shook his damp cap near the fireplace, and that was when he saw her. Priscilla Halberton-Smythe was seated in a winged armchair near the window, looking effortlessly composed in a cashmere sweater that was the exact blue of the Sutherland sky after a storm. She was observing the room with the detached, slightly weary gaze of someone who had spent her life navigating the eccentricities of the upper classes. "You look like you've been pulled through a hedge backwards, Hamish," she said, a small, amused smile playing on her lips as he approached. "It's the Highland way of exfoliating, Priscilla," Hamish replied, sinking into the chair opposite her with a grateful groan. "Blair has Angus in the back of a van, and the village is in an uproar. I don't suppose you've been watching the mindful lot. They seem a bit more agitated than a yoga retreat warrants." Priscilla leaned forward, her voice low. "They aren't just agitated, Hamish, they're circling. I was in the dining room when the news broke. Julian wasn't just a lifestyle consultant. He was a predator. He'd convinced Serena and Godfrey to invest every penny of their savings into his mindful brand, promising a massive buyout from a conglomerate in London." "Aye, the Bain and Bitterton letters," Hamish muttered, remembering Mrs. Kennedy's gossip. "And the volcano vindaloo he never ate while he was shouting about leeks and leeches." "Exactly," Priscilla nodded. "But there's more. Godfrey, the one who calls himself an emotional architect, isn't just an employee. He's Serena's brother. Julian was playing them against each other, threatening to cut Serena out of the deal because she'd discovered he was funneling the investment money into offshore accounts. He called her a clumsy girl and told her she'd be lucky to find work as a chambermaid once he was finished with her. Hamish watched the guests across the room. Serena was sitting by the bar, her hands shaking so violently that the ice in her glass rattled like dice. Godfrey was standing over her, his hand on her shoulder, not in a gesture of comfort, but with a grip that looked remarkably like a restraint. "He's a big man, that Godfrey," Hamish observed, his eyes narrowing, "strong enough to move a boundary stone if he had the leverage of a shovel and the motivation of his life savings disappearing." "Perhaps," Priscilla said thoughtfully, "but Julian was found face down, wasn't he? He was eating that porridge. He was comfortable. He didn't hear anyone slashing the canvas behind him. And Serena, she's been a champion shot putter in her university days, Hamish. Don't let the bird-like nerves fool you. She has the back of a Highlander when she's pushed." Hamish rubbed his chin, the stubble rasping under his thumb. The social dynamics were far more treacherous than the mud on the moor. Julian had been the sun around which these people orbited, but he was a sun that had started to go cold, threatening to take their futures with him. "And Julian's watch?" Hamish asked. "A gold Rolex, according to the hotel register. Why would a murderer take a watch but leave a diamond ring worth 10 times the amount?" Priscilla's eyes sparked with interest. Perhaps it wasn't about the gold. Julian was obsessive about his schedule. He recorded everything, voice memos, appointments, even heartbeat logs, on his smartwatch. If there was a record of the argument or a threat made in the hour before he died, that watch would be a death warrant for whoever was in that yurt. Hamish felt the familiar click of a puzzle piece falling into place. Blair was looking for a physical motive, a land dispute, a local grudge. But the real motive was digital, financial, and deeply personal. He stood up, his joints popping. "I should go and see if I can find that watch before Blair decides to do a thorough search and ends up accidentally kicking it into the lock," Hamish said. "Be careful, Hamish," Priscilla warned, her gaze following Godfrey as he led his sister toward the stairs. People who lose their life savings often feel they have very little left to lose, and Blair isn't the only one who might be watching you. Hamish gave her a small, grateful nod. He walked toward the bar, playing the part of the tired, defeated policeman, but his mind was far away from the comforts of the hotel. He needed to get back to the yurt, but he also needed to avoid the forensic team that was still crawling over the site. Most importantly, he needed to know why Julian Vane Tempest had been eating porridge in the middle of a Highland afternoon, when he had a perfectly good, albeit cold, vindaloo waiting by the door. Hamish stepped out of the hotel's side entrance, the heavy oak door clicking shut behind him and severing the tense, perfume-heavy atmosphere of the residents' lounge. The rain had turned into a soft Sutherland downpour, the kind that didn't bother with the dramatics of thunder, but simply went about the business of drowning the world in silence. He whistled low, and Lugs emerged from the shadows of the porch, looking like a very wet, very grumpy floorcloth. "Aye, Lugs. The socialites are biting each other's tails," Hamish murmured, his eyes scanning the village square. DCI Blair's car was still parked outside the station, the blue light now switched off, but the man himself no doubt inside, sweating over a desk and trying to force a confession out of old Angus. Hamish knew the clock was ticking. Once Blair officially charged Angus, the paperwork would become a mountain that even a Highlander couldn't climb, and the real killer would be halfway to Inverness or tucked safely in a hotel bed, laughing at the stupid locals. He didn't head for the station. Instead, he made a wide circle back toward the slopes of the gables. He needed to see that boundary stone again, but more importantly, he needed to see the mud where Angus had supposedly stood with his shovel. Hamish moved with the practiced ease of a poacher, his long legs eating up the distance while staying low against the stone dikes. When he reached the perimeter of the yurt, the forensic team had retreated to their van to escape the deluge, leaving the site guarded by nothing but yellow tape and the indifference of the mountains. Hamish knelt by the back of the tent, where the canvas had been slit. Blair had pointed to a set of disturbed patches in the earth as proof of Angus's presence. Hamish leaned closer, his nose nearly touching the freezing mud. He wasn't looking for fingerprints. He was looking for the truth of the weight. Angus had a hip that clicked like a grandfather clock. When he walked, he dragged his left foot, a shallow, unmistakable furrow in the soil. Hamish examined the prints near the slit. They were deep, yes, but they were perfectly symmetrical. The person who had stood here had balanced their weight entirely on the balls of their feet, steadying themselves as they levered the heavy stone. "Not a limp in sight, Lugs," Hamish whispered. But then he saw it, the subtle clue that Blair's heavy-handed team had trampled right past. Caught in the jagged edge of the slit canvas was a tiny, shimmering thread. It wasn't the rough, greasy wool of a Highlander's jumper, nor was it the high-tech nylon of a forensic suit. It was a strand of white silk, delicate and expensive. Hamish reached out, snagging the thread between his calloused fingers. It matched the silk of the robe Julian Vane Tempest had been wearing, but it also matched the ivory pashmina Serena had been clutching in the hotel lounge. He looked back down at the mud. Near the stone's original resting place, there was a small circular depression, too small for a boot, too deep for a cane. It was the exact diameter of a designer Wellington heel. Julian's white boots were flat-soled. Angus's boots were hobnailed and ancient, but Serena's mindful gear included a pair of stylish wedged rain boots. The red herring wasn't just Angus, it was the shovel itself. Blair assumed a shovel was needed to move the stone because that's what Angus happened to be holding when he was caught. But Hamish looked at the angle of the slope. The stone had been perched on a natural lip of granite. It didn't need a shovel to move it. It needed a gentle, calculated push at the exact moment the victim was positioned below. "And why would he be positioned there, Lugs?" Hamish asked the dog, who was busy sniffing a discarded container of organic porridge near the yurt's entrance. Hamish walked over to the bowl. He remembered the cold vindaloo sitting by the door. Julian was a man of extremes, shouting one minute, meditating the next. But he was also a man who hated peasant food. Why would he be face down eating bland, lukewarm porridge? He picked up the bowl, tilting it in the dim light. At the very bottom, beneath the congealed oats, was a faint, bluish residue. It wasn't a spice, it wasn't a fruit. Hamish recognized the scent immediately, the sharp chemical tang of the industrial-strength sedative the local farmers used to calm nervous ewes during shearing. The realization hit him with the force of a Highland gale. Julian hadn't been crushed while meditating. He had been drugged, positioned like a prop, and then the stone had been tipped to hide the fact that he was already unconscious, or dying. Murder. A theatrical cover-up for a poisoning, and the missing watch wasn't a trophy. It was a heart rate monitor. If the watch showed Julian's heart had stopped before the stone fell, the accidental boundary dispute theory would crumble into a premeditated execution. Hamish stood up, the silk thread tucked safely into his pocket. Blair was about to arrest a man for a crime that required a surgeon's precision and a chemist's cabinet. As he turned to leave, a shadow flickered near the trees at the edge of the property. Someone was watching the yurt. Someone who knew that the lazy policeman was starting to look a little too closely at the mud. Hamish didn't chase the shadow. To do so would have required a level of cardiovascular exertion that he found fundamentally offensive in such weather, and more importantly, it would have alerted the observer that he was anything but the slow-witted Highland Bobby he pretended to be. Instead, he made a grand show of tripping over a hummock of heather, letting out an exaggerated groan that was lost to the wind, and fumbling with his torch as if he couldn't tell the lens from the battery pack. He limped away toward the village, his shoulders hunched against the rain, looking for all the world like a man defeated by a bit of mud and a lack of a warm fire. Lugs, a veteran of these deceptions, played along by stopping to lift a leg against a yellow police line sign, adding his own mark of indifference to the formal proceedings. Once he was well clear of the gable's perimeter, Hamish's limp vanished. He didn't head for the hotel where Blair was likely still barking orders, nor did he return to the station. He directed his steps toward a small, whitewashed cottage on the outskirts of Lochdubh belonging to Geordie MacNab. Geordie was a man who knew the temperament of every sheep in the county and possessed a memory like a filing cabinet for any transgression committed on his land. "The kettle's on, Hamish, but don't think I'm giving you any of the good biscuits," Geordie grunted as he opened the door, his face looking like a piece of cured ham. He ushered the wet policeman into a kitchen that smelled of wet wool and peat smoke. "I suppose you'll hear about the Londoner who got himself turned into a pavement." "I am that, Geordie," Hamish said, gratefully accepting a mug of tea that was strong enough to stand a spoon in. He leaned back against the warm stones of the hearth, the steam rising from his greatcoat in a ghostly cloud. "It's a strange thing, a man being crushed by a stone he spent weeks complaining about. I don't suppose you saw any of those mindful folk wandering near your shearing shed lately? The ones with the expensive boots and the bewildered expressions?" Geordie spat into the fire, the embers hissing. "The lot of them came through on Tuesday. Julian, the big-headed one, was leading them like a flock of confused geese. He was shouting into a little black box about synergy and market penetration. But it was the other one, the tall fella who looks like he's swallowed a coat hanger, who was lingering. Godfrey. He was asking me all sorts of questions about the blue marking dye and the sedative we use for the rams. Said he was interested in traditional Highland medicine. I told him it wasn't medicine, it was chemistry designed to keep a half-ton of muscle from breaking my ribs, but he just smiled that oily smile and kept looking at the medicine cabinet. Hamish's hazel eyes sharpened behind the steam of his tea. "Godfrey, you say? And did you notice anything missing after they left, Geordie?" "A bottle of the blue quietener," Geordie said flatly, "but I figured the man just wanted to see if it worked on his nerves. They're a twitchy lot, the Sassenachs." Hamish nodded slowly, the pieces of the hidden motive clicking together with the cold precision of a clock. It wasn't about the buyout. Not entirely. If Godfrey had been stealing sedative, he hadn't just been planning a murder, he'd been planning a performance. And then there was the matter of the leaks. Mrs. Kennedy had mentioned legal letters, and Mr. Patel had heard Julian shouting about a talentless leech. In the dry, cynical world of M.C. Beaton's Highlands, murder was rarely about grand passions. It was usually about the terror of being found out. As Hamish finished his tea, he realised that Julian Vane Tempest hadn't just been an arrogant outsider. He had been a man who enjoyed holding power over others. He had likely discovered that his emotional architect was a fraud, perhaps someone with a criminal record in the medical world, who was using the mindful brand to hide from a past scandal. Julian hadn't been planning to take Godfrey with him into the new conglomerate. He had been planning to throw him to the wolves, using the offshore leak as an excuse to purge the company and claim the millions for himself. The murder wasn't a crime of greed. It was a crime of survival. Godfrey hadn't killed Julian to get the money. He had killed him to stop Julian from revealing that the architect was nothing more than a disgraced nurse with a penchant for overprescribing. The missing watch was the final proof. It contained the biometric data that would show Julian was sedated long before the stone fell. "I have to go, Geordie," Hamish said, standing up and reaching for his soggy cap. "And thank you for the tea. It's given me a bit of clarity." "Find the man, Hamish," Geordie called out as the policeman stepped back into the night. "But don't go making yourself look too clever. Blair's already ordered a celebration dinner at the hotel for when he hauls Angus to the cells tomorrow." Hamish smiled grimly to himself as he walked back toward the village. The trap needed to be set, but it couldn't be a trap of logic and evidence. Blair would only ruin that. It had to be a trap of Highland superstition, and the one thing an urban killer like Godfrey would truly fear, the idea that the useless locals knew exactly what he had done. He needed to make the killer believe that the evidence wasn't hidden in a laboratory, but in the very gossipy heart of Lochdubh. The night had settled over Lochdubh with a heavy, claustrophobic intimacy, the kind that made the stone cottages seem to huddle together for protection against the prying wind. Hamish made his way back to the Lochdubh Hotel, not through the front entrance where the police lights were still casting rhythmic, nauseating shadows, but through the side door leading to the kitchens. He found Mrs. Curry scrubbing a pot with a ferocity that suggested she was imagining it was DCI Blair's head. "Still at it, then?" Hamish asked, leaning against the doorframe and looking particularly bedraggled. "That man is a glutton, Hamish," she snapped, not looking up. "Demanding steak and kidney pie at 10 o'clock at night while that poor old man Angus sits in a damp cell in Strathbane. It's a disgrace. And those Londoners aren't much better, whispering in the lounge like they're at a wake for a man they clearly hated." "Aye, well, everyone's a bit on edge," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a dreamy, vacant tone. He reached into a jar on the counter and retrieved a dry ginger nut biscuit. "I was just telling that Sergeant Anderson that it's a shame about the watch. That gold Rolex Mr. Vane Tempest wore. It's a powerful thing, gold. It attracts the eye, even in the dark." Mrs. Curry paused her scouring pad mid-stroke. "The watch? I thought you said it was lost." "Oh, it is lost." Hamish lied smoothly, loud enough for his voice to carry through the service hatch into the residence lounge. "But young Dougie, you know, Angus's grandson, he was out by the loch edge near the Gables an hour ago, looking for his lost ferret. He told me he saw something shiny and yellow glinting in the reeds, right near where the water meets the mud by the old jetty. He was too scared to go in after it, mind you. Thinks it's a kelpie's eye or some such nonsense. I told him I'd go down there with a proper dredging rake first thing in the morning, once the light is up." From the other side of the hatch, the low murmur of conversation in the lounge stopped abruptly. Dredging came a voice. Godfrey's voice, sharp and high-strung. In the middle of the night. Isn't that a bit dangerous, Constable? Hamish wandered through the swinging doors into the lounge, looking like a man who had forgotten where he was. Godfrey was standing by the window, his hand gripping a glass of brandy so tightly his knuckles were white. Serena was huddled on the sofa, her bird-like eyes darting between Hamish and her brother. "Oh, not tonight, sir," Hamish said with a wide, toothy grin that didn't reach his eyes. "The loch is a treacherous mistress after dark. No, I'll wait for the sun, but Blair is quite excited. He thinks if we find the watch it might have, well, he calls it biometric evidence. Apparently, these new watches can tell you exactly when a man's heart stopped. If it stopped before the stone fell, then it's murder, plain and simple. Not that it matters for poor Angus. Blair's convinced the old man used a needle before he used the rock." "A needle?" Serena whispered, her face ashy. "Aye," Hamish sighed, shaking his head. "To calm him down, you see, like a sheep. But don't you worry your heads. You'll be back in London soon enough once the divers have finished their work tomorrow. I've even marked the spot with a little white rag on a branch so I don't miss it in the morning." Godfrey's expression was a masterpiece of controlled panic. "Well, that's very thorough of you, Macbeth. I think we'll retire now. It's been a taxing day." "Sleep well, sir," Hamish called out as they hurried toward the stairs. "The Highland air is a great sedative, or so they say." Hamish waited until the sound of their footsteps vanished down the carpeted hallway. Then he turned and walked back into the kitchen, his posture straightening and the bovine look in his eyes replaced by a cold, sharp focus. He didn't have a white rag, and young Dougie was currently fast asleep in his bed, but he knew the psychology of a city man who thought he was the only clever person in a village of peasants. Godfrey couldn't risk the watch being found. He couldn't risk the biometric data proving Julian was dead before the accident occurred. He would have to go to the loch tonight to find the spot Hamish had so helpfully marked. "Are you going back out in that, Hamish?" Mrs. Curry asked, watching him pull his cap low over his brow. "I have a date with a Kelpie, Mrs. Curry," Hamish replied. He slipped out the back door and whistled for lugs. They didn't head for the jetty. Instead, Hamish took a shortcut through the gorse and bracken, positioning himself on a high ridge overlooking the loch. He didn't need a rake or a diver. He just needed to wait. In the distance he could see the silhouette of the gables, and then, a few minutes later, the thin, flickering beam of a torch moving down the slope toward the water's edge. Godfrey was moving quickly, stumbling in the mud, his expensive city coat flapping in the wind. He reached the reeds and began frantically kicking at the muck, his torch swinging wildly as he searched for the non-existent white rag. Hamish watched him for a moment, feeling a familiar, weary sadness. People would do almost anything for a bit of gold and a quiet life, but in Lochdubh, the land always had a way of pulling the truth to the surface. "Now, lugs," Hamish whispered, beginning his descent. "Let's see if the architect can build his way out of this one." The mud by the loch was a thick, sucking sludge that seemed determined to swallow Godfrey's designer boots whole. He was bent double, his torch beam dancing erratically over the black water and the tangled reeds, his breathing coming in ragged, panicked gasps that were audible even over the lapping of the waves. He looked less like an emotional architect and more like a cornered rat, his composure stripped away by the cold and the terrifying possibility that a piece of gold-plated technology was about to speak for a dead man. "It's a treacherous bit of shoreline, that—" Hamish's voice drifted out of the darkness, calm and conversational, as if he had just run into a neighbour at the grocery store. Godfrey spun around, his torch beam hitting Hamish directly in the eyes. Hamish didn't flinch. He stood just a few yards away, his hands resting easily in the pockets of his greatcoat, Lugg sitting stoically by his side like a stone gargoyle. "Macbeth!" Godfrey hissed, the light trembling in his hand. "You nearly gave me a heart attack. I couldn't sleep. I thought I'd come down and see if I could help find the watch, to expedite matters for the poor local man you have in custody." "That's very civic-minded of you, sir," Hamish said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. The mud didn't seem to cling to his boots the way it did to Godfrey's. He moved with the sure-footedness of a man who had walked these moors in his sleep. "But I'm afraid I told a bit of a tall tale. Young Dougie didn't see anything shiny, and I didn't mark any spot with a rag." The silence that followed was heavy with the scent of wet peat and realization. Godfrey lowered the torch slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You lied? To a witness? That's entrapment, Constable. I'll have your badge for this." "It's only entrapment if you're looking for something you shouldn't have, Godfrey," Hamish replied, his voice hardening just a fraction. "And the only reason you'd be out here in a Sutherland gale, risking a soaking, is if you knew that watch was actually in your pocket. Or perhaps at the bottom of the loch, where you threw it after you realised Julian's heart rate data would prove he was dead before the stone ever touched him." Godfrey let out a sharp, jagged laugh. "You're delusional. Blair has his man. Angus was the one with the grudge. He was the one with the shovel. Angus has a bad hip and a soul that's too grumpy for murder," Hamish said. "But you have a bottle of blue sheep sedative from Geordie McNabb's shed and a very desperate need to stop Julian from telling the London buyout team that his emotional architect was a fraud with a revoked medical licence. You didn't tip that stone because of a boundary dispute. You tipped it to hide the needle mark and the fact that you'd already poisoned him in his sleep." Godfrey's face contorted, the refined mask of the London professional sliding away to reveal a desperate, ugly rage. "He was going to ruin me. He was a parasite. He took everything and gave nothing, and now you've taken his life," Hamish said quietly. "I'll take the watch now, Godfrey, and the sedative bottle if you're still carrying it." Instead of reaching into his pocket, Godfrey lunged. He wasn't a fighter, but he was driven by the frantic energy of a man who saw his entire life collapsing into a prison cell. He swung the heavy metallic torch at Hamish's head with a guttural scream. Hamish, who usually moved as if he were made of slow-motion treacle, transformed in an instant. He ducked the blow with a fluid, athletic grace that would have stunned DCI Blair, his long arms snaking out to catch Godfrey's wrist. With a sharp, practiced twist, he used the man's own momentum against him. Godfrey went face first into the freezing mud, the torch flying into the reeds with a splash. Before Godfrey could scramble up, Hamish was on him, pinning him down with a strength that was surprising for such a lanky man. Lugs added to the chaos by barking ferociously an inch from Godfrey's ear, his teeth bared in a very convincing display of canine aggression. "Easy now, sir," Hamish panted, his knee pressed firmly into the small of Godfrey's back. "The lock is cold, and you're already a mess. Don't make me have to drag you through the gorse. It's hard on my uniform, and Mrs. Curry is already annoyed about the mud in the kitchen." Godfrey sobbed into the silt, his spirit broken as easily as the mindful facade he had built. Hamish reached into the man's sodden coat pocket and pulled out a heavy gold smartwatch. The screen was dark, but the truth it held was safe. He also found a small glass vial with a trace of blue liquid at the bottom. "Aye, the biometric evidence," Hamish muttered, standing up and pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "A very clever invention, these watches. They tell the time, the weather, and exactly when a man has been betrayed by his friend." He hauled Godfrey to his feet, the man now shivering uncontrollably and covered in Highland muck. As Hamish began the long walk back toward the village, leading his prisoner like a stray sheep, he looked up at the moon emerging through a break in the clouds. The confrontation had been messy, and his boots were ruined. But as he looked at the lights of the hotel in the distance, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. The peace of Lochdubh was almost restored, even if he still had to figure out how to give the credit to a man he couldn't stand. The trek back to the Lochdubh hotel was a slow, squelching affair, punctuated by Godfrey's intermittent sobs and the rhythmic jingle of the handcuffs. By the time the lights of the village square flickered into view through the drizzle, the emotional architect looked like a man who had been excavated from a peat bog. Hamish, conversely, had adopted a look of profound exhaustion and bewildered incompetence, as if the capture of a murderer was a confusing accident he hadn't quite cleared with his union. He didn't take Godfrey to the station. He knew DCI Blair would be in the hotel dining room, likely deep into a second helping of Mrs. Curry's steak and kidney pie, and basking in the glory of his impending arrest of old Angus. Hamish nudged the side door open with his shoulder, ushering his muddy prisoner through the service corridor and straight into the brightly lit dining room. The sight was a study in Highland contrasts. DCI Blair sat at the head of a long table, his napkin tucked into his collar, a forkful of gravy-laden crust halfway to his mouth. When he saw Hamish enter, followed by a trembling, mud-caked Londoner in irons, the fork clattered to the plate. "Macbeth!" Blair roared, his face transitioning from gravy-grease shine to a dangerous shade of crimson. "What in the name of the Lord is this? I told you to stay at the station. And why is this man in cuffs? Have you been practicing your Wild West fantasies on my witnesses?" Hamish stopped in the centre of the room, looking down at his boots with an expression of sheepish apology. He took off his sodden cap and wrung it out, a stream of cold water hitting the carpet. "Oh, sir, I am that sorry to interrupt your dinner," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, slow Highland lilt. "But I think your brilliant strategy worked a bit too well. It's just as you suspected, sir. Your pressure on the villagers, especially that clever bit with Angus, it must have completely broken poor Mr. Godfrey here." Blair blinked, his eyes darting between Hamish and the shivering Godfrey. "My strategy? The pressure?" "Aye, sir," Hamish continued, nodding vigorously. "I was just out for a bit of air, doctor's orders for the lungs, you know, when I saw Mr. Godfrey running toward the loch. He was shouting about how he couldn't live with the guilt, not after the way you'd been looking at him with those detective's eyes of yours. He was trying to throw this gold watch into the deep water, saying it was a cursed witness to his crimes. I only just managed to catch him before he did himself a mischief." Hamish reached into his pocket and produced the gold smartwatch, now sealed in a plastic evidence bag. He placed it on the table next to Blair's pie. "He's been confessing the whole way back, sir," Hamish lied smoothly, ignoring Godfrey's indignant gasp. "Something about a sedative from the shearing shed, and how he couldn't let Julian ruin his career. I didn't understand half of it, all that London business talk, but I knew you'd want to be the one to officially take the statement. After all, it was your psychological warfare that flushed him out." Blair's chest began to swell, the anger in his face replaced by a look of smug, predatory triumph. He looked at the watch, then at his sergeant, Anderson, who was already reaching for a notebook. The prospect of a high-profile conviction, backed by biometric evidence and a broken suspect, was a ticket out of Strathbane and into the higher echelons of the force. "Psychological warfare, eh?" Blair muttered, wiping his mouth with his napkin and standing up. He puffed out his chest until the buttons of his waistcoat groaned. "Well, yes, I suppose it was. I knew the moment I laid eyes on this lot that one of them was a weak link. I just needed to tighten the noose until he bolted. Good work, keeping him from drowning himself, Macbeth. I suppose you can manage to write a very brief report on how you assisted me." "I'll do my best, sir," Hamish said, looking remarkably like a man who struggled with basic sentence structure. "Though I'm sure your official report will be the one the papers want to see. DCI Blair's masterstroke in the Highlands has a grand ring to it, don't you think?" "It does, Macbeth. It certainly does," Blair agreed, already imagining the headlines. He turned to Anderson. Get this man into the car and call Strathbane. Tell them to release the old man, Angus, with a warning. Tell them I used him as a stalking horse to bait the real killer. It was a calculated move." Hamish watched as they led Godfrey away. He saw Priscilla Halberton Smythe standing in the doorway of the residence lounge, a glass of sherry in her hand and a knowing, ironic smile on her face. She knew exactly what he had done. He had just handed over the biggest case of the year on a silver platter, ensuring that Blair would be too busy with press conferences and promotions to ever think about transferring a useless constable from Lochdubh. As the sirens faded into the distance, heading south toward Strathbane, the hotel returned to its usual quiet rhythm. The murder had been solved, the outsider was in custody, and the status quo had been preserved. Hamish let out a long, genuine sigh of relief. "Is the pie finished, Mrs. Curry?" he asked, wandering back toward the kitchen as Luggs trotted ahead of him. "There's a bit left, Hamish," she grumbled from the shadows. "But don't think you're getting it for free just because you've been assisting the great DCI Blair." Hamish smiled. He didn't mind paying for the pie. It was a small price to pay for the privilege of staying exactly where he was. The morning broke over Lochdubh not with a bang, but with a shy golden light that turned the rain-washed puddles into shimmering mirrors of the Sutherland sky. The aggressive roar of the police convoy had been replaced by the rhythmic, comforting clatter of milk bottles and the distant, melodic call of a curlew across the heather. The circus had left town. DCI Blair was likely already halfway to Strathbane, mentally drafting a press release that would feature the word mastermind at least half a dozen times, all in reference to himself. Hamish Macbeth stood on the pier, his tall, lanky figure casting a long shadow over the still waters of the loch. Luggs sat beside him, his tail thumping occasionally against the damp wood, both of them watching a small rowing boat make its way across from the far shore. It was old Angus, recently liberated from the cells and looking, if possible, even more cantankerous than before his arrest. "I hope you're happy, Macbeth," Angus shouted as the boat bumped against the tyres of the jetty. He climbed out, his hip giving a loud, metallic-sounding crack. 14 hours in a room that smelled of industrial disinfectant and despair, and all because you couldn't tell the difference between a boundary dispute and a Londoner's vanity. "It was a tactical manoeuvre, Angus," Hamish replied mildly, reaching out a hand to help the old man onto the pier. "Blair needed a stalking horse, as he called it. You were the only man in the village with enough grit to play the part." Angus huffed, though the mention of being a stalking horse seemed to soothe his ruffled pride just a fraction. "Grit? I was nearly fed a ham sandwich on white bread, Macbeth. White bread! It's a miracle I survived. And that Londoner, the one who tried to flatten the yoga man, I hope they give him a cell next to a bagpipe player." "I imagine he'll find the silence of prison quite mindful," Hamish murmured. He watched Angus hobble off toward his cottage, the old man already muttering about the state of his fences. A light footfall on the wood behind him signalled the arrival of Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She was dressed for travel, a sleek leather bag over her shoulder, but she paused beside Hamish to look out at the mountains. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and salt. "So, Blair gets the promotion, the villain goes to jail, and you get to stay in a damp police station with a hole in the roof," Priscilla said, her voice carrying that familiar edge of affectionate skepticism. "Most men would call that a failure, Hamish." "Most men like to be shouted at in cities, Priscilla," Hamish said, finally turning to look at her. "I like it here. The mountains don't ask for reports, and the loch doesn't care about my career prospects. Besides, if I were a detective inspector, I'd have to wear a tie every day. It would be the death of me." Priscilla laughed, a bright, clear sound that seemed to linger in the Highland air. "You're the cleverest lazy man I've ever met. Just don't think I didn't see you at the loch edge last night. You move quite well for someone who claims to be falling apart." It was the adrenaline, Hamish lied effortlessly. and the fear of Mrs. Curry's wrath if I tracked more mud into her kitchen. Safe travels, Priscilla. He watched her walk away toward the hotel car park, a small pang of something, regret perhaps, or merely the usual Highland melancholy, touching his heart before being tucked away. He had a village to protect, even if that protection mostly involved ignoring minor infractions and drinking tea. By the time he returned to his own small cottage, the mindful moorland retreat was a fading memory. The Sassenach guests had fled in a fleet of taxis, leaving the gables empty and shuttered, its Victorian windows staring blankly out at the water. The village had already reclaimed the story, turning it into a tall tale that would be told over drams of whisky for years to come, the night the stones of Lochdubh decided to settle a debt. Hamish hung his greatcoat on the peg and went to the fridge. He retrieved the silver salmon he had poached the previous afternoon, the fish that had started this whole messy business. He sliced a piece for lugs and a generous portion for himself, placing it into a heavy iron pan with a knob of butter. As the fish sizzled, Hamish sat at his small wooden table and opened a fresh bag of coffee. The steam began to rise, swirling in the shaft of sunlight that cut through the kitchen window. He looked around his humble room, the peeling wallpaper, the pile of unread circulars from headquarters, and the stove that needed a good blacking. It wasn't much, but it was his. He had avoided the transfer, he had saved a neighbour, and most importantly, he had a perfectly cooked salmon for his breakfast. "Aye, lugs," Hamish said, leaning back and closing his eyes as the warmth of the coffee hit his throat. "It's a grand thing being useless. It gives a man so much time to see the world as it really is." The village of Lochdubh was quiet once more, its secrets tucked safely behind stone walls and beneath the peat. Outside, the rain began to fall again, a soft, gentle Sutherland rain that promised to wash away the last traces of the city, leaving only the mountains and the lawman who knew how to listen to their silence. The last of the butter-fried salmon was a memory, leaving only a lingering, savoury scent in the small kitchen that even the damp Sutherland air couldn't quite disperse. Hamish stood at the sink, slowly washing his single plate and fork, his movements rhythmic and unhurried. Outside, the morning sun had already lost its brief golden battle with the clouds, and a familiar slate-grey curtain of rain began to sweep across the loch. To anyone else it might have seemed a gloomy prospect, but to Hamish it was a protective barrier, a watery wall that kept the frenetic, demanding world of Strathbane and London at bay. Lug sat by the door watching a single fat raindrop track its way down the glass. The dog knew the routine. After a successful poaching and a solved mystery, there was usually a period of profound intentional inactivity. But a village policeman's work was never truly done, even if that work mostly consisted of being seen to be doing nothing. Hamish pulled on his heavy greatcoat, still slightly damp from the night's exertions, and stepped out into the village. The square was quiet, but it was the busy quiet of a place that had already processed its excitement. At the post office, Mrs. Kennedy was busy sorting the mail, her eyes sharp as a hawk's for any new legal envelopes that might signal the next drama. She gave Hamish a curt, knowing nod as he passed. The news that DCI Blair was taking all the credit had already circulated through the village like a slow-moving flu, and the general consensus was one of amused approval. As long as the police from the south were happy with their medals and their press conferences, they would stay in the south. Hamish's path took him past the Lochdubh Hotel, where the last of the mindful moorland guests were loading their suitcases into a waiting Mercedes van. They looked haunted, their faces pale and their movements jerky, as if they expected the very mountains to fall upon them. Godfrey was gone. Serena had vanished into a discreet private clinic in Inverness to recover from the shock, and Julian Vane Tempest was a cold entry in a forensic ledger. The Highlands had chewed them up and spat them out, and as the van's tyres crunched on the gravel leaving the village for the last time, Hamish felt a strange, fleeting pity for them. They had come looking for peace and found only the reflection of their own internal chaos. He climbed the hill toward the gables one last time. The white yurt was still there, though it had collapsed in the night, the canvas fluttering in the wind like the wing of a grounded bird. The yellow police tape had been torn loose, snapping against the fence. The boundary stone sat exactly where it had fallen, a silent, mossy monument to a man who had underestimated the weight of the land he tried to own. Hamish looked at it for a long moment, then reached out and patting the cold granite. "Aye," he whispered. "You've done your job." Returning to the village, he was intercepted by the mail van. Jimmy, the postman, leaned out of the window with a grin that showed more gum than teeth. "Letter for you, Hamish." "From the big house in Strathbane. Looks official. Maybe they're finally giving you that medal for outstanding services to the quiet life." Hamish took the envelope with a sense of mounting dread. If Blair had been too successful, the chief constable might decide that Lochdubh was too important a post for a mere constable. He tore it open with trembling fingers. It was a formal commendation, written in the stiff, self-important prose of a man who loved his own signature. It praised Constable Macbeth for his diligent support and unwavering adherence to procedure during DCI Blair's exemplary investigation. But the sting, or rather the salvation, was in the final paragraph. It noted that, while Macbeth's local knowledge had been moderately useful, his lack of initiative in the early stages of the crime suggested that he was best suited to remain in his current, low-impact position where he could continue to develop his rudimentary policing skills. Hamish let out a breath he felt he'd been holding since the first stone was moved. He wasn't being promoted, he wasn't being transferred. He was officially considered a useless peasant by the highest authorities in the land. "Good news?" Jimmy asked, idling the engine. "The best, Jimmy," Hamish said, tucking the letter into his pocket. "The very best." He spent the rest of the afternoon in a state of blissful, sanctioned laziness. He visited the minister, who thanked him for ensuring the moral equilibrium of the parish with a glass of sherry that tasted like liquid sunshine. He stopped at the curry house, where Mr. Patel insisted on giving him a small tub of mango chutney as a reward for keeping the riffraff out. By the time he returned to his cottage, the fire in the stove had burnt down to a warm red glow. Hamish sat in his armchair, the old springs groaning in welcome. He picked up a book of Highland poetry, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. The rain had stopped, and the loch was now a sheet of polished obsidian, reflecting the first few stars of the evening. Lochdubh was back to itself, a place of gossip, small feuds, and a peace that was as deep and dark as the water. Lugs settled at his feet, letting out a long, contented sigh. Hamish reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears. The world outside could keep its mindful retreats, its biometric watches, and its desperate scrambles for power. Here, in the damp heart of the Highlands, the only thing that truly mattered was the warmth of the fire, the taste of a poached salmon, and the knowledge that, for at least one more season, the policeman of Lochdubh could sit quietly and listen to the secrets of the hills. He closed his eyes, the book sliding from his lap. As sleep began to pull at him, his final thought was not of the murder, or the killer, or even the promotion he'd escaped. It was about the river. The rain had been heavy, and the water would be high tomorrow. It was perfect weather for another salmon,